And I'd like to thank the Desmond Grieve School for asking me to chair this interesting and important session. My name's David Gibney. I'm the Communications and Campaigns Officer for Mandate Trade Union, Retail and Bar Workers. I've also been involved in the Right to Water and Right to Change campaigns. We have, over the last couple of years, along with Lynn, who's one of the speakers today, dealt with the European Commission on a number of issues around water, and maybe that will come up later on. We have three speakers, and I'm going to ask Karen Devine to kick off. She's got a PowerPoint, so after this session is finished, we'll lift up the screen, so you'll have to bear with us. It'll take a minute or two, and then the panel will go up and we'll continue the session. We'll take questions and answers at the end. So first speaker will be Karen Devine, as I said, lecturer in international relations and specialist in EU affairs with DCU. Then I'm going to ask Lynn Boylan, MEP for Dublin and Sinn Féin, to speak, and then Brian Denny from the RMT over in London, over in the UK to speak. So without further delay, Karen.
Thanks very much to the organisers of the Desmond Grieve's Summer School for allowing me this opportunity to talk. So I'm going to talk about three main points, and I use PowerPoint because I think a picture can tell 1,000 words. So what I'm going to look at is behind the media myths. I'm going to take one or two media myths and just look at the reasoning behind these myths as to the reasons why people voted to leave the European Union in the referendum last June 2016. And I'll present some empirical evidence that basically shows that these arguments are in fact not based on evidence and are myths. I'm going to secondly look at why the Brexit referendum writing was on the wall given EU-UK politics in the last 10 years. I won't be able to go through all those examples, I'll just take two, given time constraints. And then the final thing I want to look at is what I call EU evangelism. It's, I suppose, to me, a quasi-irrational adherence to the European ideal, such that individuals who support European integration don't actually pay any attention to the outcomes of the processes of integration and the impact on the people, 500 million citizens who the EU is supposed to serve. And what I'll do is show, again from a paper I've written, show the impact of the bailouts, not in Ireland necessarily, but I'll use Ireland as a comparative case, but the impacts of the bailouts in Greece and Cyprus on their adherence to a European identity and trust in the EU institutions. So, without further ado, Brexit. Why did people vote to leave the European Union? We know the result was 52% to leave, 48% to remain last June. And I suppose what I want to draw your attention to is that those who were young and who had a university degree were most likely to want to remain in the European Union. So conversely, those who are older and those who are educated to GCSE level or lower were more likely to want to leave the European Union. So in a way, this is about age and class, and ultimately it's about opportunity and whether you are served by the European Union and Britain's membership of the EU or not. And this is one I'm going to come to a little bit later. So just to remember those figures, that the more likely you're more likely to vote to leave the EU if you don't have a degree, you're lower skilled or lower educated, and if you're older. One of the big media myths I thought was, people who voted no are just racists. They just don't like other people outside of the UK, and a nasty bunch, really. And so, in the wake of the referendum, some of the newspapers were publishing headlines like "Lasting Rise in Hate Crime After the EU Referendum Figures Show." So, in a way to kind of try to connect no voters or people who wanted to leave the EU with this kind of undercurrent of, well, we just don't like foreigners. And so what I want to do is to show you data from England and Wales in relation to hate crimes and the rate in the rise of hate crimes. So what they did was, in this report, they have it indexed at 100 to the rate of rape crimes in April 2013. So that's your base level. So how much does it rise above that level in relation to that base of 100? And you can see here that the peak is hit in July 2013. An annual peak is hit in July 2013. And if you look at it again, in 2014, the annual peak is in July. 2015, the annual peak is yet again in July. So in 2016, what is the annual peak? It is actually going to be in July. So I added in that data, as you can see, and basically the projection would be, that the annual peak is once again in July. So it is the case that basically hate crimes rise by about 10 basis points every year, and the peak out of all the 12 months in that year is in July. So hate crimes are rising, and they're rising every year, and they're rising every July, which has nothing to do with the Brexit referendum. They're rising because of other factors. But the way they spun this story is, oh, race crime has rocketed in the wake of the decision to leave the EU by the British people, a majority of British people. So I just wanted to see, well, let's look at external data. Are the British really that racist? I don't have time to go through these figures with you, but just to say, comparatively speaking, most people in Britain feel that diversity makes their country a better place to live, 1 in 3. Balanced against nearly 1 in 3 that perhaps would say it's a worse place to live. But comparatively speaking, it's a much larger cohort. It's nearly as large as Sweden. But you can see that in other countries it's a lot smaller, like Poland, Greece, Italy. The number of people who believe that diversity actually helps. And then immigrants today are a burden on our country because they take our jobs and our social benefits. Again, the UK is has the second smallest cohort. Again, just over 1 in 3 who would agree with that. So comparatively speaking, the British aren't really that racist. And that's, I suppose, some empirical evidence to back that up. So I would regard this basically as a myth, one of the big myths that was put out there. So my second point is just to look at, I suppose, immigration in terms of data. And what I found was there's a tale of two halves when it comes to EU immigration to the UK. So in the first, say, 20 years of membership of the European Union, actually migration from the EU was fairly neutral. Didn't add an awful lot to the overall population. The number of Britons that left and the number of EU citizens that came in basically hit a neutral ground. The issue then was in the later stages, and in particular in the 3 years running up to the Brexit referendum, since 2011 essentially. And you can see here that there is quite a steep rise. So before there was around 50,000 coming in, and then it started to rise up to a peak in 2015 of 270,000 a year. So over 250,000 on a base population in England of about 50 million, which is quite significant. So what is the effect of that? Let's put it in context in terms of compared to Commonwealth immigration. In 2001, basically about 50,000 people were coming in from the EU, as I said, but the non-EU immigration was around 300,000, which is quite a lot. But by the time you get to 2015, those numbers are very different. By the time you get there, you can see that, in fact, in 2015, 227,000 came in from the EU, and only 115,000 came in from outside the EU, if you know what I mean, the Commonwealth. So essentially, EU immigration is set to surpass all other immigration that has been historically associated with the UK. And what I wanted to see was looking at this map, and the one on the left is, again, England and Wales, and the green parts are the areas where people overwhelmingly voted to remain, okay? And the red parts are where they voted to leave. This, on this side, is basically the density of non-UK nationals, non-UK born people. So the darker it is, like London here, for example, the more the density of non-English, non-British, non-UK citizens. So I suppose I started to see a correlation between the colours. So the greener it is, the more likely it is to be darker. So in other words, where they wanted to stay was the most diverse in terms of nationality. And I thought that that was quite interesting. And you can read it whatever way you want. And then I suppose the ones that were least likely to favour, and again I don't have too much time to stay on this, but you can see the patterns that I've circled there and the ones squares in blue to show the inverse relationship. And that those who wanted to remain were most likely to be ethnically diverse. So the real story, I think, is immigration. Because the EU generally paints a very rosy picture of immigration. It says that studies show that mobility is positive, contributes to economic growth by filling existing labour market shortages. All very good. But the negative impact is basically ignored by the Commission. So the impact on domestic wages, contracts of employment in certain sectors of the labour market. So the real wages in the UK have fallen significantly. And the UK currently has the highest levels of wage inequality in its history. And that, combined with an increase in relative poverty, sort of set the stage for this Brexit referendum. And this is the socioeconomic conditions. The TUC, the Trade Union Congress, said that UK workers are suffering the most severe squeeze in real earnings since Victorian times. So this is extremely significant to understand why people voted to leave. Even a European Parliament report in 2015 said income inequality has increased at the bottom of the wage distribution scale across the European Union, but it has been most acute in the UK. And here's the most important point. The London School of Economics published a report last year in which they looked at the impact on the free movement of workers and immigration. And what they said was UK wages may be held down by EU immigration, particularly in the lower income unskilled sectors. So to remember back to my first slide, who voted to leave, it was those in the C2DE social class and older people. So you can see here that it's not that British people are racist, it's that their working conditions and their living conditions are negatively impacted. So that's my first major point. And this, again, I have maps to show empirically that this is the case, because if you look at earnings per week, the more you get into red and white zones, the richer people are in terms of their average weekly earnings. The more blue, the poorer they are. And you can see that the same patterns of areas, I sort of call this a little seahorse. This is your Cambridge area. This is your London area. That the more you earn in a weekly wage, the more likely you are to want to remain because you benefit and your working conditions are not affected. But if you earn a lower wage, your living and working conditions are extremely affected. And the evidence is there. Correlation is not causation, but I think that's a better example. Secondly, and this is a very short point, why the writing was on the wall. I can't go through all these points given time, but there's a number of issues that occurred in the last 10 years that the British took exception to, the British government took exception to. Breaking the no bailout clauses in the Lisbon Treaty, the creation of the SEM and the Treaty on Stability and Growth, the stability mechanism and its sister treaty, the method of electing the Commission President, and I'll talk briefly about that, the imposition of a financial transaction tax. It hasn't actually started yet, but the UK was outvoted at the Council of Ministers, and other states are going ahead with this through enhanced cooperation. And then a European Defence Union, which is a real, I suppose, priority for the Commission and for some member states. So as I say, I don't have time to go through all of it, but it's interesting just to point very briefly to Theresa May's speech. And I extracted a couple of what I thought were reasons why the government was happy to support the leave. They said the public expect to be able to hold their governments to account very directly, which you can't do in the European Union. It's too indirect. The EU has struggled to deal with diversity of its members. It bends towards uniformity, not flexibility. And in fact, that was one of the reasons why Brexit, the referendum happened, was because EU would not give David Cameron his conditions that were laid out in his letter, which could have easily been done. And then she says, the respect we show to one another, the importance we attach to our institutions, so you respect the result when it happens. this also, I suppose this leads to this notion, and this is the Daily Telegraph, so take it as you will in its political context, but when you look at how the British see themselves, again, I just highlighted in bold the points: the rule of law, the sovereignty of the Crown, no appeal to a higher jurisdiction, that's why they hate the ECJ. If you look at political culture, Anglosphere, again, freedom, justice, the rule of law. The last one, the British character, the Saxon wrote Kipling, never means anything seriously until he talks about justice and right. Now, obviously, in Ireland, we might have a slightly post-colonial interpretation of this. But what we're trying to do is to understand the British mind. Okay, it doesn't mean we have to accept this as truth. But we're trying to understand what is going on in the British mind and why they have such an issue with the EU. And this gives you some indication. So I've just highlighted some of those there. So what happened then in terms of these two treaties? So the Treaty on Stability and Growth and then the ESM. So effectively what happened was, and this is in an interview in the Financial Times, Pierre Lellouche, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, said, it explains some of the reticence. It is expressly forbidden in the treaties by the famous no bailout clause. De facto, we've changed the treaty. This does not go down well with the British notion of law, rule of law, justice. Christine Lagarde was quoted by the Wall Street Journal. We violated all the rules because we wanted to close rank and really rescue the Eurozone. The Treaty of Lisbon was very straightforward, no bailout. So we know that that's basically what happened. Very last point in this section is that this is kind of telling a story of how they changed, the EU changed the method of electing the Commission President in 2014. Normally the results of the European referendums to the Parliament is supposed to feed into the decision made by the heads of government in the European Council. But Angela Merkel, who had backed actually Jean-Claude Trichet, she asked me to be a candidate, or sorry, not Jean-Claude Trichet, I'm thinking of the ECB former president, Jean-Claude Juncker, asked me to be a candidate in November 2013. I knew she would keep her word. I never had a moment's doubt about that. So basically, David Cameron was completely isolated. He thought that he had Merkel's back in respect of this, but he actually didn't. Usually, as it says, there's 28 heads of state and government, and it's them who elect the job. I'm just going to speed through that basically. This is what David Cameron's reaction was. He said, I believe that working together we could have found an alternative candidate who supported and who commanded the support of every member state. He said he believed in the principle that the European Council should be the one to propose the candidate, and that's what the treaties lay out. And so this system is called the Spitzenkandidat. It comes from the German word. He said, this development risks undermining the position of national governments and hands new power to the Parliament. And again, the British are not Euro-federalist. And so basically this was a justification by one of the candidates. Okay, yes, the treaties say that the parliamentary election results have to play a role, but if they're to play a role, then whoever wins the election should have the first shot. That's not what the treaties say. So David Cameron is upset about that. So that ends that section. And my final point, evangelism. This notion that adherence to the goal of European integration without any real attention paid to the effects, and whether the effects are actually married with what the treaties say are the goals of the European Union. So this idea of saving the euro, this is an extract from an Irish Times article, 2011, written by Dan O'Brien, and it was with Brian Lenihan, who basically explained that he was bounced into taking the bailout by the ECB. He said during the bailout talks he tried to get governments, when he wanted to impose losses on bank senior bondholder, he said it was the one issue on which there was considerable amount of dialogue and argument, but the option was ruled out by the Troika. He said that he talked with Trichet and Dominic Strauss-Kahn, who was with the IMF at that point. He said it was clear to me there was no budge whatsoever in the discussions. Why is this? Well, just to understand the effects of this, the ECB researchers had said that most of the money spent in terms of the bailout had not gone into assets that would generate a return for governments, particularly in Ireland. So Ireland topped the chart, spending 37% of GDP on bailing out banks, followed by Greece by nearly a quarter. And what they found was most of the money spent in Ireland and Greece in particular did not actually yield a return. And my question is, well, where did the money go and why was the ECB so adamant that Ireland could not burn the bondholders? And the answer lies with Wall Street and credit derivative institutions, and I name them here. What actually happened is encapsulated by a gentleman called Michael Hudson. He said, neoliberalism is not simply an economic philosophy, it's interwoven with American foreign policy. Take the case of Ireland when it bailed out the banks a few years ago. Europe was coming to an agreement, the IMF also, with Ireland to write down the debts until Timothy Geithner called from the Treasury and said, wait a minute, you can't write down the debts. Because American banks have written credit default insurance, and American banks will take a bath because we've bet that Ireland will pay. So don't bail it out. And this is worth billions. So Europe and Ireland both surrendered and said, okay, we're going to follow you. Same thing in Greece. And you only need to, I suppose, listen to Yanis Varoufakis on this. Same thing in Greece. The IMF even got into an argument with the EU saying you can't be that bad against Greece. You really can't force it into such a deep recession. And what was the response? The US got on the phone and said, wait a minute. The American banks have written default insurance. You cannot write it down. If you do, we're all going to have to pay through the nose, and we're not going to take the loss. I have lots of data on this, but don't have time to show it. So the issue isn't bank profits or capitalism. It's specifically the US, and it's the US that has the veto on the IMF, the United Nations that has a veto on the World Bank. And it's essentially Jean-Claude Trichet bending to Timothy Geithner, who's acting on behalf of Wall Street and those naked credit default swap institutions. So my final point, and I know I'm going a little bit over time, apologies. Really? Okay. So this is looking at the effects of this. Now in my lectures with my student, I show some of the propaganda issued by Bloomberg and other US news outlets. And they have this really shocking cartoon where they just have these stick figures. And they show Greeks going to the beach, putting their legs up, drinking whatever, ouzo, and just having a great time. And then they show the Germans in their suits and ties being, very good citizens and paying their taxes and not proliferate at all. And actually, they don't know the real story. They don't know the CDS issue and why Greece was treated the way it was, and the same with Cyprus in a way. So what I wanted to do to see if the Greeks and the Cypriots, the people who know what happened, okay, they're not fooled by Bloomberg propaganda, they know what happened. Has it had an effect? And this is where we get into the demise of the European Union, in which it is actually going to implode itself. This is trust in the European Union institutions. And I want to highlight Greece here. 82% of Greek people do not trust the EU. Just 4% trust the institutions, and this is a significant change. I don't have time to show you previous historical graphs, but... And then if you look at Cyprus, Cyprus has a similar pattern. 72% don't trust EU institutions, and just 9%, just under 1 in 10 people actually trust the EU institutions. What about attachment to the European Union? Let's look at that. Again, if we highlight Greece, and we highlight Cyprus. So in Greece, 67% are not attached. In Cyprus, 77% are not attached. So between 2 and 3 Greeks and nearly 3 and 4 Cypriots are not attached to the EU, and they show the lowest levels of attachment of all member states' populations. And as a political scientist, I would expect this, that it has an impact on their attachment to the European Union. But has it had an impact on their own national attachment? I would hypothesize it shouldn't. In fact, perhaps it should even enhance it. Now, the Greeks and the Irish have always topped the polls in national pride, and it's kind of strange. I think we could probably debate the reasons why Ireland did not follow Greece and Cyprus in relation to a fall in trust. However, that's to do with the propaganda here in Ireland and how successful it is. But in terms of Greece, you can see here that in fact most of them are extremely attached to their own country. Just 2% are not attached, 98% of both Greeks and Cypriots. So that shows the disparity between the EU and national attachment in the post-crisis situation. So I suppose I'm going to leave it there. This is just showing that UK people did not believe that the EU was capable of dealing with financial crisis. Just 4% of people said that it did. This is my final slide. So as a political scientist, you want to predict what would lead to changes in attachment to Europe and therefore public support for further European integration. And as you can see, an exclusive national identity, issues of fiscal transfer, types of capitalism, personal economic prospects and national attachment are extremely important. So if you look at Greece and Cyprus, I would predict if they had an opportunity to have an exit referendum that they would vote to leave. Thank you.
The speaker I'm going to invite up is Lynn Boylan, MEP for Dublin and from Sinn Féin.
Thanks to the Desmond Greaves School for inviting me here to speak. It's an interesting topic because I suppose it's quite open, the challenge of Brexit, because I could spend the 10 minutes I have speaking about the nuts and bolts and the actual intricacies of the challenge of Brexit, particularly for the island of Ireland and the north of Ireland especially, and what it means for them in Brexit, or else to look at the broader picture and kind of taking from some of the themes of what Karen has spoken about. So I've decided to do that, and then if you want to get into the nuts and bolts of the negotiations, we can do that in the Q&A. I don't disagree with anything that was in Karen's presentation. I think it's important that we have the facts as to why Brexit happened. But I suppose for Sinn Féin, and as a Sinn Féin elected rep, we see ourselves as Eurocritical, and to campaign against a Brexit, some people were surprised by our position on it and criticised us, and that's their right to do so. And I think certainly for us all within the party, we were uneasy about how do you temper the balance of, I suppose, fighting to remain into an organisation and an institution that you campaigned against joining in the first place and that you criticise on a daily basis. But I think what it came down to was that the situation that removes a part of Ireland from the EU and that would further copper fasten that part of this island to the British Union, raising the real threat of a hard border on the island in what is still a bedding down peace process, is something that Sinn Féin certainly couldn't sit idly by and allow to happen, and had to take an active role in the Brexit campaign. And I don't think anyone can say that there's a situation, whether you're left or right, where Brexit will be positive for the north of Ireland. I don't think that there's anybody who can argue that. It's a largely farming community. They will see their livelihoods destroyed. Britain gave up on its agricultural sector years ago, and it has no interest, and it's shown that it has no interest in the north of Ireland when it came to Brexit. But there is, in saying that, obvious challenges exist in terms of the north of Ireland, and I think as a political rep, and I think all politicians should be united to ensure that there is no return to a hard border on this island. But in saying that, there's no doubt that the EU is a neoliberal monster, and that it has a neoliberal agenda that has led to citizens in some countries turning to far-right parties for answers. And it was really interesting looking at the data that Karen had in the slideshow, because I think we all know that the rhetoric around the Brexit campaign was disgusting. It was anti-immigrant, and it did dominate the campaign, certainly in the public airwaves. But I don't think you could simply dismiss it that the people who voted for Brexit were racist, and that's why I think that data is really, really interesting. Because I suppose those who spearheaded the campaign, particularly the UKIPers and those really hardline Tory Brexiteers, they absolutely, the campaign they ran was racist. But many of those who voted were the families who've been chewed up and spat out by the neoliberal agenda. They're people who are tired of everything being commodified. They're tired of seeing the purpose of life being reduced to being an economic entity. And when you're forced to compete with immigrants for what are basic resources that should be available to everyone. So I think that the understanding of why people voted for Brexit is so important, and not to just simply dismiss it as that racist vote. But what Brexit has done is it's sent a shockwave through the establishment. It's bedded down a little bit now, whereas the EU, the institutions are rallying around trying to salvage the project. But it does present a challenge to us on the left, that we capitalise on that shock that has been created by Brexit, and what I believe is to create the environment for a radical reform of the European Union. And I think within the GUE-NGL group for the Parliament, those who would advocate a leave for any countries would be actually in the minority. The majority of the political parties are still of the idea that we can reform it, but that are not in denial as to how difficult a project that would be. But I think the first thing that which we all agree on is that the Fiscal Compact Treaty has to be repealed immediately. What it has done, it has enshrined austerity into law, as those of us who campaigned against it said it would. We're now seeing that even the Irish Labour Party are talking about the need for a review of the rules. But it is enshrined the austerity in the law to the point that the EU has committed itself to this economic model, which is devastating consequences for ordinary people. And it's how do you challenge that? But there is a possibility. I mean, the Fiscal Compact Treaty will be decided in January whether to put it into the EU legal framework. So member states have an opportunity to start that process, and I think that's the first thing we should be focusing on in the fallout of Brexit, is to repeal that Fiscal Compact Treaty. And I know that the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, is giving his State of the Union address in Strasbourg on Wednesday. And he is going to talk, or it's widely expected, anticipated, he's going to make the case for greater EU integration. And that is the problem we see at the heart of it, is that they are forcing through this model that nobody wants. The European Barometer polls show that citizens across the EU don't want more powers going to the European Union. They don't want more integration. What they want is protection of jobs, job creation, is their number one. Reduction in inequality is up there with one of the things that they think the European Union should be focusing its priority on. And yet the institutions are ignoring that and driving ahead with something that the people don't want. So I do think that without that radical reform, the EU is destined to fail. It will implode at some point if we don't reform it. So within, again, the European part, the other part that they're really, really driving is the militarisation of the EU. And Brexit has really thrown up a challenge for us, and particularly for neutral countries like Ireland, because Britain was a brake on this drive for further integration and militarisation, not for the reasons that you or I would be opposed to militarisation, but they did have a brake and they did have influence over trying to stop that drive for an EU army. And now that they're gone, there has been lots of talk and lots of push for an EU army to be set up. They have set up a headquarters now, so it's all just about the language, but they are in effect setting down the foundation for that European army. The other things, I think the challenges that Brexit hold for us in Ireland is we have to accept that there have been benefits from the European Union. And how do we keep those benefits and lose the things that have been negative? And my background is environmental law. That's what I'm most comfortable speaking on. And I don't think anyone could argue that if you can solve climate change on a nation-by-nation basis. You have to work together in the framework of the fact that member states are I suppose, have to meet criteria when it comes to climate change goals. It does put the brakes on their development. Poland would be pushing ahead with lots and lots more coal. Ireland is driving an agricultural model that's unsustainable. So the EU has had some positivities on that. The regulation of food products, health and safety standards being set at an EU level makes sense. The precautionary principle is something that's fundamental, and those of us who are opposed to TTIP and CETA always point to the precautionary principle and how important it is. So we have to look. The challenge is how can we, as I said, keep those benefits, reap them, increase them, so that citizens feel the benefits where it makes sense to make decisions at an EU level, but halt the really negative elements of it. So I don't think if Ireland was to leave the EU tomorrow that we would be any better off. I don't think that there's nothing to suggest that if we had an Irexit tomorrow, that suddenly voters would move away from voting for Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. And just like in Britain now, in the situation they're in, Brexit in the hands of the Tories is a Brexit that will actually see a speeding up of the worst policies of EU neoliberalism, without the balance of the social measures that did benefit citizens. So those voters in Britain who voted because of their lack of opportunity, because of the rising wage inequalities, they're now going to face much worse so long as the Tories are in power. So under a Tory government, trade deals like TTIP will be fast-tracked if the Tories are in power, because workers' rights, food, environmental standards will be burned on a bonfire of regulations. We've seen the American Chamber of Commerce already set out what it wants from a trade deal with Britain. So I think realistically, for those of us on the left, the big challenge of Brexit is, one, yes, we need to reform and mobilise together to reform the EU. But we have to start at the member state level. We have to get more left-wing governments into power at the national level. We need more left-wing governments at the council table. Nobody wanted to see Marine Le Pen elected in France, but equally there was very few of us who celebrated the election of Macron, because we know that Macron and his pro-EU integration policies will only deepen the problems that are being faced by those disadvantaged families in France. He's not going to deliver the change that's needed, and he's not going to halt the destruction of their living standards. In fact, he's going to exacerbate it. So if I was in the left parties in France, I would be mobilising like never before to win back those voters from the far right by the time the next election comes around, because I know that's what the far right are doing now. They know that Macron is just a stopgap and that those people are not going to be any happier in a few years' time. And I think you've seen in the last British election that a campaign of hope and one of a promise of real social change brought Corbyn within a hair's breadth of becoming the Prime Minister. So people are open to the idea of something different. The problem is that the right managed to communicate that in a more straightforward manner and an easier way, that is, people are grasping onto something and directing their anger in the wrong way. And I think Corbyn proved that you can, if you engage in the debate with them, you can win those voters back over. And I was at the summer school in Sinn Féin summer school yesterday, and Paul Mason was speaking, and he was saying, making that point, that a lot of people who were even active members of UKIP, who would have been on the grassroots level, not at the leadership level, but active grassroots members, who were saying, yes, we'll take a Labour poster now because we just wanted to hear you talk about the issues that are affecting us in our lives, which is around proper jobs, non-precarious work, about proper living standards, about housing, about the health service, about education. So I think that the reform we need at the EU level would be less of a challenge if we can change the balance of power at the national level. But I still believe that even within the current EU framework, you cannot use it as an excuse for not trying to have social change. And I think the Portuguese is an interesting case study at the moment, because there's a left coalition, and finally the Social Democrats on the left have come together to form this coalition government. They're not doing everything that you would want, and I think it's the same with Jeremy Corbyn. He's not going to be able to achieve everything he wants, but they've already increased a new tax brand for high earners. They've increased social protection payments. Their programme for government is one that moves Portugal back in the right direction and trying to undo a lot of the austerity measures. As I said, we point to trade deals like CETA and TTIP as sort of indicators of the powers we've given to Brussels. But those trade deals can be still blocked at a national level. So while it is true that Lisbon gave the negotiation powers to Brussels, the current governments that we have at the various member states are actually happy with that situation. It allows them to pursue their neoliberal agendas without having their fingerprints all over it. So we've seen that because Wallonia, which was just a region, was able to expose that fact by blocking CETA and forcing it to be sent to the ECJ for legal scrutiny. And so while we rightly criticise the EU Commission for their trade policy, and the clandestine nature of it, so that all has to change, the Irish government has it in their gift to block that trade deal. It is the Irish government that are refusing to even debate it in the Dáil because they don't want people to talk about it. They want this to pass through under the radar so that the Irish citizens won't know what happened to them until the implications of those trade deals start to come home to roost. And then, of course, they turn and say, well, that was the EU that did it. So we have to be very clear in knowing that really when we want to effect the proper change, the challenge of Brexit is to change the governments at member states, and then at a council level you will have a more progressive voice. So I think, as I said, to conclude on that, I do believe we can radically reform the EU, but I also am not in denial that I think that the EU may implode before that happens. But if we do want to reform it, it starts here in Ireland. That's where the battle is. So we should be cooperating with others across Europe on the left, but we have to convince Irish people first that there is a progressive alternative to the neoliberal model.
Thanks, Lynn. Interesting point about the fiscal treaty there. I wonder if we were to repeal it, I'd imagine we'd need another referendum in Ireland because it is enshrined in our constitution as a result of the last referendum. So I'll ask Brian Denny now.
I'm here to tell you what goes on in the British mind. God knows. But Karen Devine has done it far more eloquently than I ever could. And I thank her for that. Because it's taken me half my speech away because I don't have to say that now. Well, first of all, I think it's the highest honour to be invited to the Desmond Greaves Summer School for me, because the ideas of Desmond Greaves as an historian and a campaigner are really fundamental to the understanding of imperialism in the age of corporate globalisation. And it was Desmond Greaves who was the first person to identify the imperialist nature and the undemocratic nature of the European Union, which is the subject of this meeting. I never met Desmond. I was far too young, but I got involved during the Maastricht Treaty campaign against the Maastricht Treaty. I was told, because Jacques Delors came to the TUC in 1988 and said, if you support the EU project, there will be full employment, there will be full workers' rights, and the weather will improve. And the delegates at Bournemouth that year stood up and pitifully sang Frère Jacques. And while some of us who knew better knew what was coming down the chute, and Desmond Greaves, unfortunately we lost him about that period. But I went to Ruskin College, and the Maastricht Treaty debate within the college, all the lecturers took this line from the TUC that the EU meant full employment and different sort of economics than what Margaret Thatcher and John Major was giving us. And despite the fact that John Major was actually forcing through the Maastricht Treaty at the time. So I met a colleague of mine called John Boyd, who was a colleague of Desmond Greaves, and we got involved with a campaign against the Maastricht Treaty. Now the interesting thing about the Maastricht Treaty, I knew I was in the right meeting when I was at the meeting this morning, when Vanessa was talking about geopolitics and the imperialist nature of the EU-US alliance. During the Maastricht negotiations, Germany offered John Major and Britain an opt-out of the euro because it's the only way they could sell it to get it through Parliament. So the Germans said, OK, we'll give you that on one condition. You recognise Croatia illegally under international law. And in a closed room, John Major agreed to recognise Croatia, and at that moment, that was the first shot was fired of what became the Balkans War. Because of a horse trading that went on in a building hundreds of miles from the Balkans, and the ethnic cleansing began. Then after that, the German military and the British military trained Mujahideen forces in Bosnia and Mujahideen forces in Kosovo, and even gave them black uniforms, the same colour as their father's SS uniforms. It was a fascist uprising supported by German and British imperialism, using the European Union as a model. And it struck me this morning that that's quite an important point, bringing on from what Vanessa was saying, because actually the Yugoslav experience was the blueprint that led to the war in Iraq and Libya and Syria. So it's a geopolitical project that Desmond Greaves identified all that time ago. And in 1968 he gave a lecture on the nature of nationalism and socialism and sovereignty, where he said the struggle for those two things, self-determination and independence, was indeed the struggle for democracy. And conversely, that's why the EU is fundamentally opposed to democracy and self-determination, constitutionally opposed to it. And the economic waterboarding and what they're doing in Greece is an example of what can happen to us all. So what went on in the Brexit vote? Obviously, there was a very narrow debate was had. Very narrow debate was had, and the left voice didn't get through. But workers didn't need a left voice to tell them that 30 years or more of deindustrialisation had been taking place. What actually happened was a campaign between two Tories. The Tory party controlled both ends of the campaign and narrowed that debate to such a point. But the real point is that the whole political establishment campaigned to remain. The Tory party the Labour Party, the Green Party, the SNP, Plaid, all campaigned to stay inside, and they had this very Westminster campaign in their bubble. And so workers voted for leaves for their own reasons beyond that side of that political narrative that they really not listening to anymore. And Britain was once an exporter of goods and services, but now has been reduced to a net importer with a scale of balance of trade that was unthinkable before we joined the European Union. And most of those laws were directly drawn up by the European Round Table of Industrialists and the big corporations and their lobbyists, and be imposed by an unelected commission without anyone in Britain even having a vote on it. In fact, over the last 30 years, there has been a wall of silence about the impacts of EU membership on our industries. And those people that set up that wall of silence never went to those communities that have been devastated across the country by neoliberal policies that were imposed upon them. And trade union rights, I mean, Jacques Delors, I'd love to get hold of him today and ask him what on earth was he thinking to think he could sell us that pup, but he did successfully do that. But the European Court of Justice has been steadily eroding workers' rights ever since. And in Greece, collective bargaining has been completely abolished. If you're a transport worker in Greece, you are conscripted into the army. It is a fascist, it's a law that was left over from when the generals were in control. You are conscripted into the army if you go on strike in certain services. That's social Europe. That's what social Europe has done, and nobody in the Commission or any other EU institution said a thing about it. There have been court cases and the Viking Laval cases where workers attempting to defend their interests against social dumping, being replaced by cheap foreign workers from countries from lower wages, were told that they could not go on strike because it infringed upon the four freedoms on which the European Union is founded upon: the free movement, complete free movement of capital, labour, goods and services as established in the treaties. Within the single market, public ownership is actively discouraged. The ECJ interpretation of Article 106 of the treaty has steadily eroded all concepts of public ownership. According to a respected law professor, Daniel Nicol, I quote, "The ECJ appears to have constructed a one-way street in favour of private sector provision. Nationalised services are prima facie suspects and must be analysed for their necessity." These programmes have been going on in every sector. I work for the RMT. Britain's railways, not Northern Ireland, it's not a UK model, the Britain's railways were privatised by an EU Directive 91/440. Today, our railways are owned by German railways, Dutch railways, Italian railways and French railways, and they export that profit back to their countries and invest in their railways. We are the most extreme version of what the EU wants. We're in front of the curve, so we know what it's like to be inside the European Union, which is by and large a Tory project from the beginning. Ted Heath took us in. Every Tory leader except for Margaret Thatcher, who was kicked out like a dog in the night in 1989 because she changed her mind on the euro currency, have supported the EU policies of endless privatisation. Article 107 of the treaties on state aid said it's only compatible with the internal market and as long as it does not distort competition. In other words, it is illegal, except of course if you're a powerful member of state, and then you can break the laws just like the stability pacts and the bailouts. You can break laws as and when in a lawless manner. Even they don't even follow their own laws. So in order to impose this profoundly neoliberal agenda, the EU has abolished the right to self-determination and democracy of all the individual states and not just Britain. And it's not a foreign plot. This has all been done in collusion with national elites. As you probably know here, it's the same in Britain. National elites get together and they form a cartel in the Brussels institutions to get as far away from their electorates as they possibly can. So the left has ceded the Brexit debate to the right, which is probably the biggest mistake since the end of the Second World War. And it says more about the state of the left in Britain and across Europe than it does about anything else. Because a failure to represent the interests of those victims of neoliberalism means they will become irrelevant, which they largely have. And Jeremy Corbyn's victories, electoral victories, was because he accepted Brexit. He started listening to the very working class that voted for Brexit because he had to. Now there are those who say we should stay in, it can be reformed and steered into a socialist direction. But the problem is, how does that come about, particularly given the direction of travel of the last decades in entirely the opposite direction, where budgets have to be balanced, countries have to deflate their way back to growth, particularly Greece. So how that works, how Greece is going to compete against Germany, I don't know how that works, but apparently it's an orthodoxy that we all should believe in, because someday Greece will be able to stand up to Germany, because they can. It's just not going to. It has no intellectual weight at all. Whole entire nations must bow to market forces and competition, where neoliberalism is now a constitutional goal. It's a constitutional goal under the treaties, and the European Court of Justice has a constitutional duty to impose neoliberalism as a constitutional goal. So we can stand on a platform of Remain and Reform, which is just, I accept that, it's just a different point of view. We can still get along, but you'd have to, in Britain, to stand on that, you'd have to stand against the 2016 vote for to get out of the EU. Now, if the Labour Party did that, then they would suffer the same fate as the Lib Dems and walk into political oblivion, in my opinion. And one of the reasons, the Tory party were the party of Remain, and now they're the party of Brexit. Because they've thought about it. After the referendum result, they thought about it. They didn't say anything for a couple of months, and they come out, we are the party of Brexit, we are the party of the workers. If you can believe that, because they're clever enough to see the vacuum and understand that political movement has to be represented, or there's a vacuum, and they will lose traction. So any reform of the EU must come about only if you win the support of the European Commission, which is unaccountable. You have to win the support of the European Central Bank and the Council of Ministers, all of which are constitutionally bound to support ever closer union within the EU under its present neoliberal treaties. That would also require a treaty change which all 28 member states will have to agree. Now, the triple lock is getting harder and harder. At the moment, the European Union is an authoritarian technocracy. Now, the more political unity it gets, it'll just turn into more and more of a tyranny. So there has to be a point where you say you have to get out and have a divorce. There has to be a point where the beatings are just too much and you have to leave. And that's at the point that the British people were at. Now, if you start ignoring that vote and insulting them, all you're going to do is make them feel even worse and more determined because they see the nature of the beast. I just want to finish on a Desmond Greaves quote that I noticed because what was behind the vote of Brexit was people don't want to be ruled from abroad. Irish people don't want to be ruled from abroad, and British people don't want to be ruled from abroad, and that's what the European Union represents, being ruled by the interests of the biggest corporations in the world. Greaves said this, he said, the activities of big business more and more prove incompatible with the most elementary forms of democracy, and national independence is one of the most important forms of democracy. And he was right then, and he's right today. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Brian. I'm not sure, is this on? It is, yeah. Okay, going to open up the questions. I know Lynn has to go a little bit earlier than other people, so I'll throw the first question at her. Seeing as she has spent the last couple of years really in the heart of the beast over in Brussels, and witnessing the arrogance of the EU and how big and powerful it is. I mean, 4 days after Brexit, I don't know if people are aware or noticed it, but 4 days after the referendum for Brexit, the EU had the arrogance to come out with a statement. I think it was Commissioner Vella, your friend, came out and told us in Ireland how we should be paying for our water, whereas told us it shouldn't be through general taxation, that we had to bring in domestic water charges. and how the EU rules themselves through the fiscal treaty that you mentioned incentivise, if not outright, enable privatisation through the debt to GDP ratios and the structural deficit targets that we've had, that you can't invest in housing, you can't invest in your own water infrastructure because it goes onto balance sheet. So in order to remove it from the balance sheet, you have to have 51% of your income going into a utility. It has to be coming directly from the end user. How is it possible to change a beast as big and as powerful as the EU? And is it possible? Because I was at the launch of the M25 over in Berlin when Varoufakis launched this campaign, and we made the point over there that for me, it's a task that is extremely difficult, if not impossible. So how can you balance that? How can you say how we can reform this beast?
I think that's why those discussions are happening, the likes of with Varoufakis as well. The problem with Varoufakis believes further integration, but left integration is the way forward. There's others of us on the left who believe a return to powers is what's needed so that member states have more sovereignty. So that debate still hasn't been sorted. We haven't squared that circle in terms of the EU. But even within the current framework and even within that beast, and it is probably one of the most frustrating things you do is trying to engage with the European Commission, because they don't answer emails, they don't come in the same way even that a minister in a national parliament would be held to account in a question and answer type scenario. They don't do that. And then you have the example, as you're saying, with the water, where they have publicly put on the record one position since 2010 on Ireland's water and how it can pay for water through general taxation. And yet, in March of this year, when the Water Committee was set up, the Special Expert Committee on Water, they completely did a U-turn on it. And I think this goes back again to even what you were saying, Karen, in your slide. It's the arbitrary nature of the rules of the EU, I think, is the part that frustrates the citizens the most, because we always see that they can break their own rules when it suits the agenda, and that frustration then just feeds into the level of anger among citizens. But even in saying that and putting all that, the really negative and really frustrating part of trying to deal with them, I still believe that Ireland can pay for water through general taxation, and I still believe that that would be upheld in the European Court of Justice, because the only precedent on the Water Framework Directive has found that in the case of Germany, where they don't have cost recovery for hydroelectric power. And yet, so I still believe they can do it. The problem, and that's what I was trying to point in my speech, is that the Irish government don't want that to happen. They don't want to take a case to the European Court of Justice to defend their right to provide water through general taxation. And that's why you have to change the government, I think, is the main way to really challenge. And you're seeing it in some parts of Europe. There is remunicipalisation taking place in Europe at the moment. I mean, in relation to water, which I'm most familiar with, you have France has remunicipalised its water and has set up a really gold standard around civic engagement and about how decisions are made in terms of the management of that water. You've had the renationalisation of the waste services in Italy, in a small town in Italy. So it is happening. There are, where you have the progressive, Barcelona is in the process of remunicipalising its water, and it never had a public water service. So where you elect the progressive politicians, I think they're prepared to challenge and to push it as far as you can go. So even, I still think it needs radical reform if it doesn't fall apart before then, but I still think you can do it if you have a progressive government.
There was a very interesting part of your presentation about trust in the EU, and I'm curious, and maybe you have the answer, maybe you don't, or maybe we can speculate about it, but why is it that the Irish seem to be the most trusting of the EU? In terms of maybe, and this is just me, but maybe it's that we just don't trust our own government to be left to their own devices. If you think about the bank guarantee, it wasn't an EU decision, it was an Irish government decision. If you think about water charges, it wasn't brought in as part of the Troika deal. It was 1 month before the Troika even came here. Fianna Fáil and the Green Party were going to bring in water charges. The EU appear to be the heroes when it comes to Apple tax, and they're telling us to take 13 billion, and we're saying no thanks, it's all right, we've got a homeless crisis, but we'll deal with it in our own way. So what is it about the Irish people, after taking 42% of the European banking debt, that we still trust the EU?
I mean, well, just to build on Lynn's point, because I do think though that
the answer in terms of the reform of the EU and the idea of a progressive government doesn't quite hit the mark, because the EU will install its own administration if it doesn't like the government that's in place. So look at Italy and Mario Draghi, look at Greece and how they blackmailed the Syriza leadership, look at Ireland and how the late Brian Lenihan was saying a couple of years later afterwards that he was bounced into the bailout. I think you cannot underestimate the power of the EU elite to be able to control the internal politics of a member state. And that, to me, is the most frightening aspect of the EU that hadn't been as obvious before. I don't know if that kind of power and that kind of determination to ride roughshod over democratic elections and the will of national people was there before, but it is there now. And I think it has to do with the concentration of global capital. I think it has to do with the fact that I think something like 40% of the wealth in the world is controlled by like 250 companies and transnational corporations. I think that to answer how Irish people are so unwilling to be like the Greeks, the Cypriots, the British, and to kind of have, there's several aspects of it. First of all, I can't get over how my own peers, who I went to UCD and I studied politics, and I remember at the time of the bailout, they kept quoting this Irish Times line of, something to do with Ireland is so lucky. What's the difference between Ireland and Iceland? And I kept looking at them going, are you mad in the head? I would much rather be in Iceland, because in Iceland they will hold a referendum on this. In Iceland their government is not going to back down the way our governments have done. And I think there's this notion in Ireland that if you read the Irish Times, you're somehow informed. I say, don't read the Irish Times, because you're just filling yourself full of propaganda. And I struggle to explain this to people who are degree-holding people, who just don't get it. Now then there's a second aspect, is that they don't want to get it. And I think there's a kind of a comfort level of the middle and upper classes. The people who are the solicitors and the business people, and those who are just doing very well, thanks very much. They don't want to know. And I think that it does come down to class, because if you talk to, and I work in Ballymun, I've been working in Ballymun for 11 years, and I deal with real people, real students, as I say, and I've gone to UCD and I've gone to Trinity, and DCU is, I love the students because they're so real, and I think that my hope is that the younger generation, and you can see this in polling, and you can even see it. Okay, the Brexit referendum was different, but in Ireland it's the younger people who are becoming more critical of the EU. It's the younger people, and I keep telling them in the lectures when I do a lecture on the bailout, you are paying for this, and you will continue to pay for this for decades, and your own children will probably be paying for this. So you're in a class of 374 students. Why? Because our budget was cut. Why was it cut? Because the government cut the budget. Why did the government cut the budget? Because the EU told them to. And that's the only way I think you can get through to people. But as I said in my talk, the propaganda, the narrowness of the propaganda that is existing in Irish media is extraordinary. And the power of the government to shut down any rational discourse based on evidence is extraordinary. And I'll go on a panel like the Lake Debate, and there'll be 6 others, and I will literally be shouted down and silenced. And people on Twitter will go, Karen Devine has been shut down, and she's talking sense. And that's how it is.
Yeah. There is a not only desire, I think there's an essential need for a new alternative media outlet in Ireland to try and get some of these ideas across. I mean, the obvious one is that Lynn is involved in the debate as well around the water charges, and there was never a fair discussion about the policy itself, no matter how much we pushed. People in the room will probably be surprised to know that we use 25% less water than the average household in the UK, that we have more water available to us than any other country in Europe, and it costs less economically to actually run a water system without domestic water charges. But you can't get those ideas across. Just a final question for me to Brian, and being a trade union.
Are you thinking of opening
Okay, I will. Can I just ask one question as a trade unionist to another trade unionist, because it's a key one that's been brought up a couple of times in the presentations about inequality. Ireland is actually more higher prevalence of low pay than the UK or anywhere else in Europe. The only countries in the world that are worse than us is Korea and the United States. And we also have the second highest prevalence of underemployment. You mentioned, well, I mean, the EU has supposedly given us a lot of positive things like worker directives. Without, like the working time directive, we've got the part-time worker directive. Without the protections of the EU, how are you and the trade union movement going to be able to protect workers, particularly in non-organised sectors like retail or in services sector? How is that possible with a Tory government in power?
Social Europe agenda is the sticky issue. So some people still think that they've got that holidays were invented by the European Commission. And
microphone. Please.
Sorry, the holiday pay and other things were invented by the European Commission. We've never had the weekend and all the rest of it, and it's really not true. I mean, most of the benefits in Britain were fought for before we even joined the European Union, equal pay and all the rest of it, and maternity pay in leave in Britain is 52 weeks. In the European Union, it's 12. So the Working Time Directive is a point in case. No member state has ever been taken to court for not implementing the Working Time Directive. It is soft law. It is never implemented. And in fact, as working for a rail union, a transport union, all we get is members coming in saying, "I have been Swedish derogated." Does anyone know what the Swedish derogation means? What it means is you are exempt from all European legislation defending your rights at work, because the Swedish derogation says if you make yourself a limited company, you're no longer covered. And they can pay you what you like. It's called the Swedish derogation. Cleaners on Southern know about it. Editorial writers in the Irish Times and the Financial Times don't know about it. But if you mention to people, to the TUC, the Swedish derogation, they know about it, but they don't want to talk about it. The Swedish derogation gets rid of all workers' rights. For me, because it makes them vulnerable workers, and there's the 0 hours legislation, the 0 hours contracts, that all comes from the European Union. Flex security, look out, they invented a word for it. They call it, if you're flexible at work, you'll have security, but you'll only have the first bit, you're being flexible, you have no security. Right? So the whole Social Europe agenda really is a cargo cult. It doesn't exist, and the TUC are still telling people that it exists and that all their rights come from the European Union, and they're still campaigning for Britain's membership of the Euro, for God's sake. I mean, they're on another planet. Actually, it's a cargo cult, and they're promoting it in their own interest to keep their own jobs. So it's a cynic. I don't want to sound like a cynic, but it's as bad as that. And on the good news, the third biggest union in Britain has come out for Brexit after the vote, the GMB, because its members are being socially dumped. The Swedish derogation, people are losing their jobs and their pay is plummeting by the day. So the GMB have come out, and which campaign for Remain, they've come out and said we want to get out because it's not getting any better.
Okay. I'll take questions from the floor. If you could just